Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. In this video, we're diving into 3 truly terrifying stories that took place deep within the most remote and isolated parts of the Appalachian wilderness. From something caught on the security cameras of someone living completely off the grid, to a home invasion that still haunts its victim, and finally, an investigation that remains unsolved to this day. To me, these stories are as fascinating as they are disturbing. I don't know about you, but there's something about those lonely, far-off places that's beautiful and deeply unsettling. The untouched wilderness, the silence, it gets under your skin. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you started happening frequently and disturbingly not long ago. Maybe 2 weeks. Though I actually think it might have been going on for longer. I just didn't want to believe it. About 5 years ago, I hit a massive crisis. I'd always seen myself as the type of person who thrived on work. I held important positions, and working was my personality. I think everyone knows at least one friend like that. The one who can never do anything, or cancels at the last minute because of work. I look back at those days with sadness now, realizing I sacrificed everything in life for my job. But at the time, I didn't see it like that. On the contrary, I was proud of being the one always on top of deadlines, literally living to work. And then, out of nowhere, without warning and without a specific trigger I could identify, I stopped being able to keep up. I grew depressed. I started missing deadlines, sleeping in, having insomnia. I began isolating myself. Before, I didn't see my friends because I was working. Now I didn't see them because I didn't even have the strength to get off the couch. And when I say strength, I don't mean physical. When I finally went to the doctor, convinced I had some terrible disease, he told me it was burnout. I was shocked. In my personal dictionary, that word wasn't real. Certainly not for me. In my head, that happened to lazy people. People looking for excuses not to work. But I fell so low that I had to accept it was real and that I was going through it. Now that I've given you some context, maybe it's easier to understand why I reached what many of you might see as a dramatic, even radical conclusion. The only way to break this toxic relationship with work was to change my life completely. Another thing about me is that once I set my mind on a goal, I follow through without looking back. So when I decided to live as off the grid as possible, within a year, I was doing it. I'd always lived relatively close to the Appalachians, so when it came time to choose a new home, those mountains felt like the perfect place. After some research, I found a spot on Spruce Mountain that was perfect. Dirt cheap compared to what I paid in the city. I bought it without thinking twice, and within a year I was relatively adjusted. Sure, it's a massive shift, moving from the city to the middle of nowhere. But like I said, when I set a goal, I'm obsessed with it. I'll just give you some notions of the land. The house itself isn't huge. It has 2 floors, but even so, it's not big compared to the land around it. That, yes, is enormous, and in reality, it's completely isolated. It takes me at least 45 minutes by car to reach the nearest village. And if I go on foot, then it's more than a day's walk. But that's exactly what I wanted. I've been living here for about 5 years now, the last 3 of which were pretty peaceful. The best decision I've ever made. At least until about 6 months ago. More disturbingly, the last 2. Living isolated means I spend a lot of time on the outskirts of the house. I try to be as self-sufficient as possible, and I produce most of my own food. Obviously, I'm not a full-on hermit. I have a car, I go to town sometimes. But still, I spend very little time actually inside 4 walls. Nothing really strange had ever happened on my property. A few lunatics had passed by. But like I said, about 6 months ago I started noticing strange things. One night, I was sitting in the living room reading a book about monocultures, when I heard a knock at the window behind me. The window was closed, but the shutters were open. The only thing I could see outside was the darkness of the trees. I stayed still for a while, but nothing. So I ignored it and went back to my book. The next day, passing by that same window, I noticed finger marks on the shutter, like someone had been peeking inside, pressing both hands there. There was no doubt they were fingers, even if they were unnervingly long and thin. More than you'd expect from a normal person. But whatever. I thought maybe it was some unlucky wanderer, like the others I'd seen before, and ignored it. What made me uncomfortable was realizing I had been sitting with my back turned while someone was right there, mere inches away, watching me. A few days later, I was in the same spot, this time with the shutter closed, when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside, followed by a whistle. I'm not even sure if it was a whistle. I just know it was a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end. I stayed alert for long minutes, listening, but there was nothing else. Just silence pressing in. I even considered the possibility that it had been something else entirely, or that I'd imagined it. But the way every hair on my body had stood on end told me my body had reacted, physically, instinctively. A few days later, I was in the kitchen heating up a late meal when I noticed movement among the trees. I looked closer and saw a shadow. I call it a shadow because I don't know what it was. I only know it stood on 2 legs and looked like a deformed man. I grabbed my shotgun and went to the front door, yelling what it wanted and warning that if it didn't leave, it would regret it. Days passed without anything else happening. Then one night, I was in bed upstairs when a stone struck my bedroom window. Not big enough to break it, just enough to get my attention. I peeked out and saw the same shadow among the trees again. Too dark to make out details, but I assumed it was someone trying to scare me. The thing that unnerved me the most was its head. It was distinctly lighter than the rest of its body, a stark shape against the darkness. I couldn't tell what it actually was, and the distance made it impossible to discern. I felt that instinctive fear again. My house is secure. I never leave anything open. Still, I went from room to room. Everything was locked. The house had been built to offer solid protection, but that was the first time I had a bad feeling, knowing I had a stalker who was either insane or had bad intentions. The next day, I did something I'd never needed to do before. I contacted several alarm companies, and that same night I installed 4 cameras around the perimeter, 1 for each cardinal direction. But nothing. The cameras picked up only small animals here and there. Until about 2 weeks ago, when they finally caught something. I'd mostly stopped checking them because I'd never seen anything. But that night, after taking out the trash, I felt almost certain something was watching me. I slammed the door, locked everything, and went upstairs to the computer streaming the live footage. For the longest time, nothing. Just the dark forest, which is terrifying in its own right. And then, out of nowhere, movement. I went instantly on alert, and then I saw it. The camera quality isn't great, but you can clearly make out someone stepping out from the trees wearing a deer head as a mask. I was stunned. It's a horrifying sight, and I didn't even fully understand what I was looking at. But I decided, whatever it was, I'd do the same as I always had in life. Face it. I went downstairs, grabbed my shotgun, opened the door, and shouted at the top of my lungs that if I saw it again, I'd shoot. I spent the rest of the night on full alert, glued to the cameras. That image burned into my brain. The next day, I barely went outside, and whenever I did, I was armed. When night fell, my muscles locked up. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like threats would make it go away. I'd already threatened it before, and if I was right, this had been going on for months. I stayed staring at the camera footage for hours. There was nothing there except the forest, which, as I said, is terrifying. Then, after about 2 hours of complete darkness, he appeared. Standing in the exact same spot as the night before. I froze again, completely paralyzed by the image. It was real. I hadn't dreamed it. I tried taking a picture of the screen, but you can't make out anything clearly. When I finally managed to break free from that wave of panic, I went back downstairs, opened the door, scanned the trees with my gun. When I saw its shadow, I fired. It didn't move. It stood there, impassive and serene, staring exactly as it had before. I've always been good with guns. My father had many, and I grew up around them. I knew I hadn't missed. But how was that possible? Panicking, I shut the door and ran back to the cameras. And there it was, staring straight into the lens as if it knew the camera was there. Right now, I'm desperate. I don't know what to do. I don't understand what I'm facing. I don't know what it is. Every night it appears and spends the whole night staring into the camera. By morning, it's gone. I'm sleep deprived and seriously considering seeing a psychiatrist. Has anyone ever faced or even heard of something like this? I need answers before I lose my mind completely. All of this happened not long ago, and I have to admit, if there hadn't been other people with me, it would have seemed like some scene straight out of a movie. Unreal. Writing this now feels like an attempt to process what I went through, maybe even understand it. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life. When I finally had the money to buy a house, it never even crossed my mind to move to another state. Even though my work-from-home job gives me the flexibility to live anywhere, I always like the isolation. In fact, my goal was to find a place as secluded as possible. 2 of my friends knew I was looking for a house, and exactly what I wanted. So when one of them sent me an online listing, I instantly knew it was perfect for me. After 2 years of slowly making repairs, The place was finally ready for me to move in. It's completely cut off from everything, way more isolated than I'd initially imagined. When I'd go hiking, it felt like I was the only person left on Earth, and I loved that. The house itself was pretty big, with 2 floors, 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and more room than I ever really needed. The land around it is thick, full of dense trees, with an old trail running down the hillside that's no longer in use. My old place is about an hour and 50 minutes away by car, and that's the closest big area. There are a few other houses near mine, but they're completely isolated and still way too far to be considered neighbors. I can scream my head off out here and nobody would hear me. Or at least, no one was supposed to be close enough to hear me. Since I moved here, I've had friends visit, mostly when they want a little getaway or to experience what it's like to live completely off the grid. They live in towns or cities, and even though the forest surrounds them, it's still a distant experience. Out here in my cabin, I'm literally living in the middle of the woods. About a week ago, my cousin David came up with a friend of his, Cedric. David's the kind of guy who thinks he knows how to handle anything outdoors. He grew up camping and hunting with his dad, while I only started appreciating isolation later in life. I knew it was going to be a shock for him. Honestly, even for David. He's used to the woods, but not for more than a day at a time. The first day was amazing. We spent it unpacking, prepping food, stacking firewood by the door. It was late October, the days already shorter and the air cooler. Lighting the fireplace is a tradition. But as expected, after one day, David started getting restless and wanted to explore a trail before sunset. He left without a backpack or flashlight, saying he'd be back in half an hour. Cedric and I stayed inside the cabin. He was flipping through a book he'd brought. I don't know how much time passed before I realized it had gotten way too dark for David to still be out there. Not long after, Cedric came up to me asking the same thing. Shouldn't David be back by now? The sun had completely vanished behind the mountains, and the weak moonlight was the only light left. We waited a little longer. Like I said, David's experienced, and I was convinced he'd be back soon. But another hour passed in pitch blackness before I said I was going after him. Cedric started putting on his coat as if he was coming with me. I couldn't bring myself to say no. But honestly, I didn't want to head out into the night with someone totally inexperienced. I asked him to stay in case David showed up. He nodded. He understood it was important for someone to stay behind, and I felt relieved. I grabbed my flashlight, a small kit I always keep ready, and told Cedric I was going to check on David. I started down the trail slowly. At first, it was just that usual discomfort you feel being alone in the woods at night, especially in these forests, these mountains. Everything intensifies at night, and all those daytime legends you laugh at suddenly feel like real threats. Still, I wasn't walking scared. I was sure I'd find him quickly, probably with a small injury. I walked until, somehow, I knew I wasn't alone on the trail. I turned around more than once, expecting to see eyes glinting in the distance, but nothing. Still, I was sure I heard footsteps besides my own. I called out for David, told him we were worried, that this wasn't the time for jokes. We needed to get back to the house. Nothing. The forest was empty of sound. I pressed on, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. 5 minutes later, I saw David coming toward me. He wasn't running, but he was moving fast, his body tense, shoulders stiff, arms rigid. Even from a distance, I could see him glancing over his shoulder. When he saw me, I felt him relax just a little, but he clearly picked up his pace. I tried asking what was going on, but he only muttered that we needed to get out of there, back to the cabin. I didn't question it. I immediately knew something was wrong, and my earlier sense was probably right. So we hurried back to the cabin, and only once we'd locked the door did he tell me someone had been following him. A man standing between the trees, not saying a word, just staring and trailing him. Cedric was clearly shaken, and I, worried that the situation might spiral into something bigger than it was, told them not to worry. We'd lock all the doors and windows. It was probably just some guy pulling a prank, trying to scare off people walking near his property. Someone from one of the isolated cabins nearby, maybe. But he immediately corrected me, saying that this man definitely didn't live in one of those cabins. He looked like he actually lived out there in the woods. He was filthy and seemed like he was under the influence of something. After peeking out the windows and seeing nothing, we made dinner, played some games, and went to bed. I did my best to keep myself and Cedric calm, but nothing could get David to relax. A couple of days passed without incident. David finally started to relax, and so did I. I'd never had problems before. I didn't want to start now. One of the warmer nights, we lit a fire outside and sat talking. Cedric and I were calm, but David kept glancing at the forest every now and then. I realized maybe that scare had been a lot worse for him than I'd given him credit for. He was clearly still rattled. The next day, we decided to do the big hike David had wanted, but this time, he wouldn't be going alone. We climbed up to a nearby peak, took hours, and came back exhausted. At some point on the trail, that same uneasy feeling came back, the one I'd felt 3 days earlier when David had gone missing. But scanning the trees carefully, I didn't see anything. When we got back, David asked if he could shower first. He said he had a slight headache and maybe the shower would help. None of us minded, of course, so I stayed in the living room with Cedric. He was clearly exhausted. He wasn't used to that kind of physical exertion, so he wasn't saying much. At some point, I realized the sound of running water hadn't even started. A lot of time had passed. Even if David was doing something else in the bathroom, he would have told us if he'd be a while. That wasn't like him. I mentioned it to Cedric, but by now he was half asleep. Had I dozed off too? I looked at the clock. An hour and a half had gone by since we'd returned. I must have nodded off. David had probably already finished showering. I got up and went to the bedroom. I knocked and called for David, but there was no answer. My hand went to the doorknob. I could feel something was wrong. My heart was pounding without me even knowing why. I opened the door slowly. What I saw is something I'll never forget. David was kneeling in the corner, eyes wide, locked on me, shaking his head slightly as if telling me not to come in. Next to him stood a man, taller than me, so thin he looked sick. Long, black, greasy hair hung over his shoulders. But the worst part was his eyes, bulging, open too wide, an exhausted and empty stare fixed on David. I asked what the hell was going on, stepping toward them. Only halfway into the movement did I notice the man had something raised, a weapon. I looked at David. A thin line of blood was running down the side of his head. I asked again what was happening, and the man shouted that David had stolen his son. We were both stunned, not knowing what to say. Cedric must have heard the noise because the next thing I knew, he was at the doorway asking what was happening. That was enough to make the man glance at him, and in that split second I kicked at the hand holding the weapon. A shot rang out, and for a few seconds I couldn't tell if I, or anyone, had been hit. David reacted instantly, shoving the man to the ground. He wasn't yelling words, just high-pitched sounds, a mix between a scream and a growl. Everything was happening at once. At some point I felt a sharp pain in my arm. The man had just bitten me. By now, Cedric had grabbed the gun from the floor and was pointing it at the man, asking what the hell was going on, who he was. David said this was the guy who'd been following him during his hike. Now I understood why he'd been so scared. The man's appearance was bizarre. Looking at him was a mix of terror and pity. I asked him again what he wanted, but by now he was just whimpering. None of us knew what to do. Probably call for help. He didn't seem like a huge threat anymore. He looked more like someone utterly miserable. Then, Cedric said something that clearly set him off. He commented that the man looked like he'd come straight out of an asylum. At that word, the man went completely berserk. Lunged at Cedric, knocking him to the floor and slamming his head against the edge of the furniture. Then he bolted down the stairs and vanished. I tried to go after him, but he ran fast, and I wasn't about to throw myself into the woods at night again. It's been 4 months since then. I've never seen the man again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. David says he has no idea what the guy meant about his son. We don't even know how he got into the house while David was in the bathroom and we were sitting in the living room. All the doors and windows were locked. I still live here, but I'm always on edge, watching for when he might come back. What I'm about to tell you happened on October 21st, 2001, when I was on a 5-day hike in the Appalachians, more specifically near the Tennessee-North Carolina border. The first 3 days were pretty interesting. The trail turned out to be more challenging than I had expected, and at one point I lost one of my backpacks. Don't ask me how it happened because I honestly have no idea. I just had it with me, and then, when I went to grab something from it later, it was gone. Given what happened afterward, I can't rule out the possibility that someone might have actually stolen it without me even noticing. Luckily, it wasn't a huge deal. The pack had some food, but I always brought extra. So, I still had more than enough for the next few days. It wasn't until the 4th day, around midday, that I came across something. At first, I only saw a blue tent in the distance, so my first thought was that I wasn't alone after all. There was someone else camping out there. To stay on my planned route, I had to pass right by the campsite. But obviously I wasn't just going to walk up and give someone a heart attack, or risk getting shot. So I tried calling out, saying hi, and explaining that I just wanted to pass through and keep going. But no one answered. I figured maybe they were out hiking or gathering firewood, so I thought I could safely go on my way. But as I got closer, I started noticing some details that really didn't add up. The first thing was that there was a sleeping bag, half inside and half outside the tent, with a bunch of stuff scattered around on the ground. The camp stove had been knocked over, and a little farther ahead, there was a blue sweatshirt covered in blood. That froze me right where I stood. Something had clearly gone down at that campsite. In a place that remote, your first thought is usually that it was an animal attack. But after looking closer, I saw the tent was full of food. Even the bag with the scattered stuff still had food in it. No animal would have just left that behind. At that point, I got really uneasy and realized I needed to turn back. So that's what I did. I wasn't afraid of walking through the forest at night. I'd done it countless times before. So I just started heading back. That's when, near a small creek, I came across a cell phone lying between two small rocks. I picked it up, figuring it would probably be dead or locked with a pin. But back in the early 2000s, people didn't always use pins, and phone batteries lasted forever. This one still had some charge left. What I found on that phone chilled me to the bone. There were a bunch of photos, which I obviously can't show since they're in police custody. But they showed several different angles of the forest, and in all of them, you could see a man. In some pictures, the man was partially hidden among the trees. In others, he was more visible, but you could never clearly make out his face, partly because old phone cameras were terrible, and partly because many of the shots were blurry, like whoever was taking them was trying to document something while running away at the same time. What scared me the most about the whole sequence of photos was that the last one had been taken right there, exactly where I was standing. That completely shocked me. It was getting dark, and I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could. Thankfully, I made it out of that forest without anything happening. But the person who owned that phone was never found. To this day, they remain missing. Since I was directly involved in the investigation, I can't and won't reveal the person's name. Out of respect for the family, for the person themselves, and because the case still hasn't been officially closed. But it was horrifying to be out there in the middle of nowhere, realizing that something terribly wrong had just happened moments before, knowing that whoever did it might still have been somewhere in those woods, and that the person hadn't even been reported missing yet when I found that campsite.